So, friends, we begin this morning not at the empty tomb, not even in Israel, not even in the Bible, but this morning, instead, I want for us to begin in the once great mining town of Butte, Montana. And I say once great because if we were to show up to Butte today, you would find a lot of shuttered storefronts, a lot of abandoned houses, streets that are most entirely deserted. But that was not always the case. Back in its heydays in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, Butte was a bustling boom town. And at the height of its production, it was responsible for a full 1/3 of the copper produced in the United States. And in fact, if you live in a house that was made in that era, you probably have some Butte copper wires running through the walls of your house. But then in the 1940s, after the end of World War II, demand for copper dropped precipitously, and the mining company began losing money. So the executives had to get together in order to come up with a better, faster, cheaper, more cost-effective way of extracting copper from the hill at the edge of town that they had been mining for decades. So they put their heads together, and they came up with this genius idea. Rather than mining into the hill like they'd been doing for years, constructing mine shafts in what was a long and arduous and expensive process, they said, hey, why don't we just blow the top off that sucker and mine the copper from an open pit? Like I said, genius level idea. And so that is what they actually did, and it actually worked. They were able to keep their doors open for about another 40 years until in 1982, economic forces conspired against them and they were forced to shut their doors for good. But on their way out of town, this company shut off the pumps that the company had been using for years to keep water from collecting in the bottom of this pit. And so slowly, over the course of years, water began to accumulate. It started just a little puddle, but then it got fuller. And then it got fuller, and then it got fuller until at 40 billion gallons, it became one of the largest lakes in the United States. Now, a quirk of geology in the Butte, Montana region is that the ground is full of a mineral known as pyrite, better known to you and me as fool's gold. And it turns out that when water and air and pyrite get together, they make... Do we have any geologists or chemists in the house? No? I actually minored in geology in undergrad. I got this covered. When air and water and pyrite get together, they make sulfuric acid. So this ginormous lake became a ginormous vat of sulfuric acid. And in turn, the sulfuric acid hastened the rate at which heavy metals from the copper ore left in the walls of this pit leached into the water. And so the waters of this lake, again, one of the largest in the United States, became a toxic brew of acid and metal. Now, to see a picture of this lake, it just kind of looks like nothing special, just a red-tinged lake. But those who have seen it in person say that the best word to describe it is technicolor. Because it's true, if you look at it from this angle, it does, in fact, look green. But if you look at it from this angle, it looks red. And if you look at it from this angle, it looks blue. And if you look at it from this angle, it looks black. Technicolor, toxic, and deadly. Sometime in the mid-90s, or to make some of you feel old, in the late 1900s, a huge storm swept over Butte just as a flock of snow geese were passing overhead, and not knowing any better, they took refuge in the waters of this pit. So when the residents of Butte woke the next morning, they awoke to find 350 geese carcasses floating on top of the pit. This pit was a pit of death, entirely inhospitable to life. That is why Several years later, when a researcher from the nearby University of Montana walked into the biology department brandishing a slime-covered stick, the biologists there were besides themselves with excitement because that stick had been pulled from the pit, a place that even these biologists did not expect to find any life. And nasty green slime though it was proof that something was alive in this pit of death. Somehow, some way, life had found a way. Life had bounced back from death. And we often make the mistake, don't we? The mistake of thinking that is what Easter is about, life bouncing back from death. Now, to be fair, we're not entirely to blame for that because obviously that is the major plot point in the Easter story that we heard read this morning. We were told that on that first Easter morning, while all of Jesus' male disciples were hidden in an upper room somewhere, quaking in their boots like little children, Jesus' female disciples boldly strode to the tomb in order to anoint his body with spices. But when they arrived, they discovered that the stone had been rolled away and that Jesus' body is nowhere to be found. Instead, they find only the burial cloths that they had used to wrap his body. And as the two women are standing there puzzling about what happened, two angels appear to them and say, "Why are you looking for the living among the dead? He is not here. He is risen." So again, obviously, Jesus being resurrected is the main event of this story. But I want to suggest to you this morning that that is not why this story has a lasting and ongoing significance to you and to me. In fact, I would go so far to say if that is all that Easter is really about, you would have been far better off this morning had you just stayed in bed and started streaming a good zombie show. The Last of Us, that sort of thing. Because it's the same premise, isn't it? That's the same premise, life bouncing back from death, but far more compelling plot lines than anything you're going to find here. So what I'm trying to get at is that it is part of the story, but it is not the whole story. There is more to it than that. You see, that slimy green stick that ended up in the biology department of the University of Montana, it got the researchers there curious. It piqued their interest because they had written off that pit for years because they did not expect to find any life in it. So they decided to go back and start scrounging around in it, see what they might find. And after about a year of looking, they found this black, slimy, globby sort of thing floating around in the water. And this is not CGI. This is just my hand. Can you believe it? We spared no expense for you on Easter. And it had the most remarkable property. This black stuff turned out to be a kind of yeast. And they found that it was absorbing the heavy metals from the water around it. It was acting like a sponge and soaking them in. Now that in and of itself is not all that exciting because for years scientists and engineers have been using bacteria and other microorganisms to filter heavy metals out of contaminated water. But usually, in most cases, these bacteria filter only about 10 to 15% of contaminants out of the water. That's it. But this black blob floating around in this pit of death was absorbing 85 to 95% of the heavy metals in the water around it. It was acting like a sponge. It was soaking them in, transforming the toxic brew around it into drinkable, showerable, teeth-brushable, squirt-gunnable water. Now, understandably, the scientists were pretty excited about this find, so they worked up a profile on this yeast to run it through their databases to try to identify it, to see where in the natural world that it occurs. Surely they were not the first people to find it. So they ran it through their databases, and it came back with one hit. Just one single hit. In all the natural world, this yeast occurs in only one place: the digestive tracts of geese. And that, my friends, that is what Easter is about. The story of Easter is not a story of God bouncing back from death to life. The Easter story is a story about God taking in, soaking in, swallowing up human violence and rejection, betrayal and abandonment, and taking all of that brokenness and transforming it into something life-giving and beautiful and good. That is why Easter has more lasting significance to our lives than the last of us, because it reveals this fundamental way that God moves in our life, in our world. And that sounds pretty, but does it actually mean anything? And I think it actually does. So here in closing, very quickly, I just want to share a story with you about a guy named Kevin. I heard of his story on the Heavyweight podcast. Does anyone listen to Heavyweight? So if you're a podcast kind of person and you want to ugly cry on your way to work, I highly recommend Heavyweight to you. But this Kevin, he grew up in public housing in Sacramento in the 1980s with his father and his mother and his 5 siblings. And his father, it needs to be said, he was violent, he was mentally ill, and he was an alcoholic. He was a man who thought nothing of whipping his children with metal hangers, no matter their age and for the slightest perceived infraction. And over time, he developed a fixation on contamination so severe that entire areas of their little apartment that they were living in together were declared untouchable and no one was allowed to enter. So even the couch and the chairs in their living room were off limits. They instead had to sit on pieces of cardboard on the living room floor. But when Kevin was 8, his mother finally left and took them to a women's shelter. And as Kevin remembers it, it was a kind of paradise, because outside they had a playground, they had bicycles, inside they had a ton of games, they had a walk-in pantry stocked with instant noodles that him and his brothers were big fans of, and they had volunteers there to play with the kids and help them with homework. But then about 2 weeks into their stay, his mother gathered all the 6 children together for a family meeting. She had written their names on slips of paper and put them inside of a paper grocery bag. And she told them that there wasn't enough money to make ends meet, and so 2 of them were going to have to go back and live with their father, and they were going to decide by lottery. So just try to wrap your mind around that. So she reaches into the bag, and of course the first name she pulls out is Kevin's. And so immediately, and of course, he just starts to cry. And he said that he had never cried that hard before, nor has he ever cried that hard since. And he was crying, of course, because he had to go back and live with his abusive father, but he was also crying because in one fell swoop, he was losing his mother and his brothers and his sisters, and all of that hit them in that moment in a flood of tears. And it was when Kevin was just a teenager that it dawned on him that his mother had most likely rigged the lottery. Her oldest was her favorite, the 3 youngest were her babies, so Kevin, who was the second oldest, and his other middle brother had been hand-selected by his mother to go back and live with his father. So as if returning to the violence and the chaos of his father wasn't enough to cope with, he also had to come to terms with his mother's betrayal and rejection and abandonment. She only stopped to see him occasionally thereafter. Now, I personally cannot even begin to comprehend the psychological and emotional and spiritual damage that would have been inflicted on a child who went through that sort of experience, and I hope that you can't even imagine it either. And I think it is safe to say that if Kevin had grown up to be an abusive person himself, we wouldn't condone it. Not at all. I'm a mandated reporter. I would not hesitate to call DCF on him. But I think we would understand it. I think we'd have a lot of empathy for him after everything that he went through. And likewise, had he turned to drugs or alcohol to numb his pain, that is a hard way to live your life, to be sure. But I don't think anyone in this room would be sitting up on their high horse looking down on him. Not at all. Especially after what he went through in his childhood. That pit was deep, and the water was toxic. But on this Easter Sunday, I am glad to be able to tell you that is decidedly not how Kevin carried his childhood forward. Kevin is now well into his middle age with 3 daughters of his own, and he is, by any accounting, a doting father. But he recalls a time that when his family's hamster had died, as hamsters are wont to do, and his daughters were absolutely inconsolable. They were just sobbing for days and days and days. And in that moment, his wife told him this. She said, "Kevin, don't worry about it. They're just kids. They don't really mean it." To which Kevin responded, "Absolutely not. I was their age when my name got pulled out of a paper bag, and those were the deepest tears I have ever cried in my entire life. Those are the realest tears I have ever cried in my entire life. So don't tell me they don't mean it. That is absolutely not true." So here's what Kevin did. He went out into their backyard, and he dug a little hamster-sized grave. And then he went and he made a little hamster-sized tombstone, and he held a full hamster funeral service so that his daughters could say a good farewell to their beloved pet. Kevin had swallowed all of that poison, the violence and betrayal, the rejection and abandonment. And what did he do? He transformed it into something life-giving and beautiful and good. And that is what the Easter story is about. It reveals this fundamental movement of God. And if Kevin's story tells us anything, it's that it's also what we're capable of when we let that same Spirit move through our lives. Friends, in the name of the risen Christ, I pray it may be so for all of you. Amen.